Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the first video of Being Conscious. Officially, this is the second video, but in terms of content, it's going to be the first video. So, I thought let's begin the journey of this channel, Being Conscious, by an iconic book which is quite old in terms of its release, but the messages, the potent messages in the book is something which each and every generation can relish. Now, I'm talking about this pocket sized book called The Seven Spiritual Laws of Success, authored by the world famous Dr. Deepak Chopra. Now, many of you who are subscribed to my channel or who have interest in conscious living would know who this gentleman is. And for the sake of introduction, he is a well-known, internationally acclaimed author who bridges the gap between science and spirituality. Now, coming to this book. Now, this book seems quite small, but each and every line, each and every word is so profound, so potent in itself, that if somebody actually 100% implements this book, his life will go through a 360-degree paradigm shift. And the beauty is that the ideas are simple, the ideas are easily relatable, understandable, and the seven spiritual laws of success are basically divided into 7 chapters, wherein Deepak Chopra dives into the depth of each of the laws. At the end of each chapter, he talks about what are the practical ways through which you and me can implement this. So I'll make 7 videos on this book because each video deserves complete explanation of what Deepak is trying to say in this book. And beginning with this video, we'll talk about the first law. So the first law talks about the law of pure potentiality. Now, if you think about the universe in general, if you think about creation in general, from the microcosm to the macrocosm, if I ask you what you and me are fundamentally made of, focus on the word fundamental. Now, you might say that we are built of this blood, body, muscles, bones, but at a fundamental level, we are all atoms. We are all energetic substances. Because you all know science, basic science, wherein we have the atomic structure and there's a neutron, there's an electron revolving around a nucleus. So fundamentally, we are, the source of our existence is energy. And if you look at our scriptures, it always pointed out to this essential truth that yet pinde tat brahmande, whatever exists in the macrocosm also exists within us, in the microcosm. So in this book, the law of 7 spiritual laws of success, the first law refers to the fact that everything in this universe is at its very source consciousness, at its very source a potential waiting to be realized. Remember the concepts of physics wherein we had this concept of potential energy and how it gets converted into kinetic energy? The entire paradigm of how hydroelectricity works. Now, potentiality, when he talks about potentiality, he means that each one of us has power to manifest, to realize our goals. Now, whether those goals are big or small doesn't really matter, because the source energy which is responsible in manifesting those goals is the very same energy which has created everything in existence. So we might think from our limited, conditioned mind that that goal is too much for me to achieve. But for consciousness or for God or whatever name you would like to call that energy, nothing is impossible. Now, all this seems quite assuring. All this seems quite hopeful and quite positive. But what are the ways through which we can realize this? Deepak talks about the necessity and the immense importance of harnessing the energy of the self. Now, there is this distinction between the different fundamental dimensions of human existence. At the very source of it is the self, which is completely devoid of the ego. Now, ego, when somebody hears this word called ego, they immediately equate ego to a sense of superiority complex. But ego is not just superiority complex. Superiority complex is a part of ego, but inferiority complex is also ego. Ego is essentially, I was reading this phenomenal book by Eckhart Tolle called The New Earth, and he gave a very simple definition of ego. He said ego is essentially a compulsive, unobserved mind. A mind which is not aware of what's happening, it is so compulsively driven. And we are so engulfed in it. Remember, we are not the mind. Mind is one of the faculties, one of the many faculties which the self possesses. And strangely enough, the self is 100 times more powerful than this ego. But the problem which most of us are facing is the self is seldom using the mind or the ego. The mind is using the self. In other words, the mind is essentially become a tyrant master of herself. And how do we know this? Deepak Chopra gives something beautiful, and he says that ego is always insecure, ego is always scared of the outcomes, it always wants to control stuff, it is very scared of every little action, but the self is quite comfortable, it's always rooted in the being. Most of us would have experienced this, that when we are in the midst of nature, something within us feels so serene. Essentially, that something within us is our true identity. But we only have a few of those instances or experiences because we are so heavily identified with the mind. And the only way we can harness the law of pure potentiality to manifest our goals and dreams is to harness the power of self. And how does one practically on a day-to-day basis harness the power of the self? Now, Deepak gives some very important practical tips which I would like to narrate from this first chapter of the book towards the end. Now, accessing the law of pure potentiality is essentially tapping into your creative potential. Because nothing in this world, even manifesting your goals and dreams, is coming from a place of creativity. Nothing can happen without creativity. No creation can happen without creativity. Essentially, one needs to tap in to his own consciousness. And he gives a beautiful example in the book where he says that if you want to draw an analogy between what it means to dive in the self or be rooted in the self versus what it means to be egocentric. Now, through the ego, one might have a lot of goals, one might have a lot of ambitions. But it is like that tornado of, let's assume that you have a water body and that water body is quite chaotic. It is moving continuously and the waters are quite muddy. Now, it doesn't really matter if you throw a stone or the entire empire, a huge building in that chaotic lot of water. It won't create an impression. But if that water body is calm, it is equipoised, even a pebble, even a short pebble, when you throw it, it will create ripples. Now, you might be wondering, what does that pebble mean? That pebble is nothing but our goals, our desires, our visions for our own well-being. And that water which he is referring to is essentially our state of being. Is our being rooted in the ego, where we are completely thriving on control and we are always insecure about what's going to happen? We live in a state of constant unease. We live in a state of constant anxiety, or we are frustrated about what happened in the past. In either of the two scenarios, we are not rooted in the self. To the contrary, we are rooted in the ego. And that is counterproductive for us to manifesting our dreams. Because let's understand, once you are in that zone, your vibration is quite low. And the only way you can vibe high is to be rooted in the self, is to be rooted in the present moment, which is nothing but accessing the field of pure potentiality. And once you access this pure potentiality, your consciousness becomes like that still water, and you can put all your pebbles of which represent your goals into that, and that will manifest quicker, in a more functional way, in a more peaceful way. Instead of having your mind chaotic, instead of being disorganized and imbalanced in your state of consciousness, no matter how many lofty goals you have, none of them will manifest. And life will seem like a complete stretch, life will seem like a labor every day. Now let's talk about the practical ways through which Deepak talks about implementing this law of pure potentiality. Now, so the first thing he says is to set aside some me time. Now, this me time is essential for us to have access to the self, access to the dimension of the self. And a very potent way to access this is through silence. Just the act of sitting silent. There was a beautiful quote which once said that the biggest cause of suffering of humankind, of mankind, is man's inability to sit in a room all alone in silence. Most people, if you ask them whether they have the ability to sit in a room all by themselves, they will be extremely uncomfortable because they cannot face themselves. They have a lot of disturbance happening in their mind, and they are always looking for some getaways, they are always looking for some escape routes which will allow them not to face that which is within. And the more we access this tool of silence, the more we get to know ourselves better, and in the process the relationship with ourselves is going to improve. Because let's remember, people are going to come in your life and they're going to live, but there's only one person who's going to stay with you till the very end, and that one person is none other than you, myself, my friend. And this is probably the most taken for granted relationship, the relationship with the self. So Deepak encourages each one of us, in order for us to access the law of pure potentiality, or to capitalize this law of pure potentiality to its full potential, we would have to take out some time for ourselves and practice silence. And this second thing which he talks about, and it's very interesting, he says practice non-judgment. Now this is, it might sound very simplistic, or it might sound that this is something very easy to do, but if you closely introspect, our mind is naturally programmed to judge. Either we are judging someone else or we are judging ourselves. Now, judging someone else is easier to understand, but what do I mean when I say that judging ourselves? Now, let's say you have this habit of always thinking, always getting conscious of what the other people are thinking about me. Now, this is a very common mental tendency, right? Most of us think what the other person is thinking about me. Most of us are quite self-conscious when we go to a social gathering or a public meeting. Now, the reason why we think like that is because we are scared of our image in front of the public. Now, interestingly, every time you think that what others are thinking of you, you are essentially judging your own self. You are judging your own self when you think what the other person is thinking about you. And let us be very honest and let us know a fact that everyone is essentially at the root similar. Now, there might be differences in tendencies and attitudes and perceptions and likings and dislikings, but human nature essentially is the same. Every human being is conscious of what the other person is thinking. We are all liking to fit into a society. So, everybody is essentially thinking what the other person is thinking about them. So, at the end of the day, nobody is essentially thinking about each other, they are only thinking about themselves. Now, the fun fact is, once you realize this point, you will stop caring about what the other person is thinking. And when you stop thinking about what the other person is thinking, you are practicing non judgment with your own self. Now, practicing non judgment is so important because there's a lot of talk about practicing non violence, there's a lot of talk about practicing the virtue of ahimsa, which is an important tenet in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the Yam Niyam Ahar. Now, ahimsa is not only about not harming someone physically, but if you closely look into it, even judgment is violence. Now, there's the human tendency is to judge. Human tendency is always to keep evaluating ourselves. Now, that is not completely bad in the way of improving ourselves, but if we overdo it, if we start judging each and everything and put them in brackets of good and bad, then we are essentially controlled by our ego, because we always like to keep judging things, and every time we judge something, we are distancing ourselves, we are getting away from the law of pure potentiality, which asks us to dwell in the self. Now, if you think about it, the closest example of the self which I can think of is the sun. If you think about the way sun rises every day in the morning, it rises equally on the sinner, on the murderer, on the rapist, and also on the so-called virtuous person. In our Shastras, the sun is equivalent to the self, the Atman, the consciousness. The sun doesn't care whether you are a sinner or you are a virtuous person. It, by its very nature, is spreading light and positivity. It doesn't judge a person that this person doesn't deserve my sunlight, but it naturally gives it, not out of compulsion, but out of its very nature, because the nature of the sun is to provide light. And sun is the source of life in this earth. If there was no source, or if there was no sun in this planet, if the sun rays didn't reach our planet, there would be no question of life. So hopefully this parallel gave you some kind of elaboration of what it means to practice non-judgment. Now, when we talk about practicing virtues, we always need to practice it in compartments. We cannot just get up one day and say that I will be a non-judgmental person one fine day. That's not possible. What we can do is we can just come up with a time-based goal that for the next 24 hours, I am going to practice non-judgment. Come what may, I will not judge the situation. I will not judge the person. And this is a very powerful way of accessing the self. And every time your mind tends to judge, you can just be aware of what's happening. And awareness is the key, right? And once you get aware, you automatically stop judging. And the third is very powerful. He says, commune with nature. Silently observe the intelligence within everything. Watch a sunset, listen to the sound of the ocean, or simply smell the scent of a flower. If you look at nature in general, it is quite high vibrational. And once you tap into the ambience of nature, automatically the vibration increases to the next level. Because nature is very closer to consciousness. Nature doesn't have certain elements in nature, do not have this tendency of compulsive thinking. And we humans can utilize this potency of a natural environment to dive into the self. Hope my today's video on the first law of pure potentiality made a lot of sense to you. And the takeaways from this video is to dive into the self, the state of pure consciousness, and there are 6 more laws which are coming with, which are equally, if not more, powerful than the law of pure potentiality. The first law is the foundation, and we have a complete pyramid to build over it. Thank you so much for your time on my video. Do let me know how you like my video. What are the points which you felt can be better? And please do share my video with a couple of people who are interested in such content. Also do subscribe to my channel. Thank you, and I'll meet you in my next video. Bye.